Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast, where we talk about following Jesus and the tension of being in the world, but not of it. My guest today is Rachael Clinton Chen, who is the co-host of the Allender Center Podcast with Dan Allender, who was a recent guest of ours on Native Exiles. Rachael is committed to trauma care, and specifically the intersection of trauma and healing as it comes to spirituality and the church. And today we have a conversation about spiritual abuse, about what this is and what churches need to know as we think about caring for people who have experienced spiritual abuse. So whether that is a part of your story or whether you just want to be better informed as how to come alongside people who are in need around you, I think this conversation is going to be really engaging, and I'm excited to get into it with you. Here we go. Rachael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's really good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
You're very welcome. Well, for people who aren't familiar with you yet, will you just introduce yourself and let people know
Sure.
who you are and what you're doing?
Absolutely. So my name is Rachael Clinton Chen, and I have the profound privilege of having been a part of the work at the Allender Center at the Seattle School for, almost 15 years now, which is wild. And I usually refer to myself as a trauma-informed pastor. Ultimately, I don't pastor in a traditional sense in this particular season. I kind of have this opportunity to work with a nonprofit that's working with a lot of churches and church leaders and lay leaders and healers and therapists and all that jazz. But I just take very seriously the harm and abuse that people have experienced, especially when it's coming in the context of a church or through like religious authority. So we can definitely talk more about that and what that means. But
well, I've been looking forward to talking about that with you. I know, I'm a pastor of a church, and I know for myself, for all the pastors that I know, we want our churches to be places of healing where we can bring our pain and our brokenness and our sin, and through the ministry of the church, the Holy Spirit can work to cleanse us, to heal us, to bring about wholeness. And yet there is the reality that sometimes not only are we not doing that, we're actually doing the opposite. Sometimes people experience brokenness and hurt and pain through the church. And so, I'm really interested in diving into that with you. I wonder if you can help us start just at the very beginning. When we're talking about something like spiritual abuse, what does that term mean? What are we referring to in that conversation?
Yeah, I know it can be a tricky term. It sounds very ethereal. It sounds very, like I say to people, it not only sounds like it, but sometimes can feel like it. It's like the little colander toys that my daughter plays with in the bathtub. And it's like the water is just pouring out and you're like, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? So I do think it's really important to define. The first thing I would say is that spiritual abuse, like all forms of abuse, is about the misuse and abuse of power. Now, what sets it apart is that it is the misuse and abuse of power in a religious or spiritual context. And what can get tricky about that is we automatically go to, okay, so a church, but it can play out in a family system. It can play out in a school system. It can play out in a nonprofit sector, or really any community or relationship where trust is being exploited and misused by someone that holds like spiritual authority. So in some ways, they're often perceived as someone who has a kind of closeness with God, is in some ways a voice of God, or maybe understands more about God. Has a power dynamic in your life. So again, whether it's a parent or a teacher or a pastor or any kind of spiritual leader that you're encountering. I think what's really true about all abuse is that all abuse ultimately at its core is spiritually abusive because it assaults the image of God in a human being. But specifically when we're talking about spiritual abuse, some people like to use the term religious abuse because they feel like it more captures like, okay, we're talking about the systems and structures and relationships in a religious structure. I like to stick with spiritual because I think it actually holds both the type of abuse, but also the site of the wound. And so again, we can talk more about how the impact of spiritual abuse is actually very dynamic and holistic. It's not just emotional or psychological, it's very bodily as well. But where it assaults us most is at that really sacred part of us that's wired for trust, wired for connection, and really wired for a safe attachment with God and
Yeah.
with, the spirit. And so it just wreaks havoc on those places, because ultimately, when you've experienced spiritual abuse, it's really like you can't trust yourself,
Hmm.
because how did you not see, or, how could you have not prevented things or done things differently, or why did you trust so much?
Yeah.
So I,
That's helpful.
there's a really good definition by the Reclamation Collective and Religious Trauma Institute, and they just say spiritual abuse is the conscious or unconscious use of power to direct, control, or manipulate another person's body, thoughts, emotions, actions, or capacity for choice, freedom, or autonomy of self within a spiritual or religious context.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. I think one of the things that's hard to maybe understand or wrap your mind around for people who are new to this conversation is what uh, classifies as spiritual abuse. I mean, so
Right.
like there's some cases that I think would just be obvious to any of us, tragic
Right.
things that I hate saying happen, but that do happen.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a pastor who is found out to have been sexually abusing a
Mm-hmm.
minor within his church or, you know, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think everybody would say, okay, spiritual abuse obviously is
Mm-hmm.
happening there. But what are some other examples that you could share of maybe things that are maybe a little less obvious or maybe
Yeah.
not the first thing that would jump to someone's mind when you're thinking about what spiritual abuse is?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot. We talk about any form of abuse, but certainly spiritual abuse, that it can range from the really subtle to the explicit. So, like you're saying, if there are other forms of abuse that someone is perpetrating because of their spiritual authority and the trust that in some ways is intrinsically there because of this position of power that they hold, that we can go. Or if someone maybe is saying, like, I am coming out of a more cult like experience where there's mind control and really rigid kind of boundaries of how you behave, and it's just really clear to see control at work. And then there can be more subtle forms that I think, you know maybe someone has, the way we talk about this is, my colleague Rebecca Vickery, she's a psychotherapist and a survivor of spiritual abuse herself, grew up in the Quiverful movement. That's her story. I will let her tell it, but she talks about different categories I think can be helpful. So she talks about reenactment abuse, which is more like, you see this huge movement of very like rigid fundamentalism coming out of people in like the 70s and 80s in response to a lot of what was happening with the sexual revolution and like a lot of drug activity in the 60s, late 60s. And so in some ways, this kind of draw to a really fundamentalist environment that then you perpetrate to your children is like a response, like trauma and generational trauma. And maybe you have good intentions, you want to keep them safe, but you're also totally fine using tactics that are coercive, manipulative, exploitative, and controlling because it's like going to be a good outcome. That's a more subtle form of spiritual abuse. Whereas you can have like narcissistic spiritual abuse, which is just really clear someone's in an abusive cycle. There are some pastors I could name that fall into this category, but I will let you use your own imagination, where there's just a history of control, manipulation, violence against people who bring questions, like a structure that very clearly positions someone to not have to have transparency, to be able to use intimidation and retaliation to kind of keep people in line, or mockery or humiliation. That's where we're moving into a kind of spiritual abuse where you're like, okay, yeah, I mean, I kind of thought of that person as a bully, but I can totally see how they're really wielding very violent tools to kind of keep the flock in line and obedient
Hmm.
and compliant. Whereas you also have forms that are just much more sadistic, where someone has actually thought out a position of power because they take pleasure in the harm of other people. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with some of these really well-known spiritual leaders, whether it's in mission organizations or mega churches, where there's a long history of sexual abuse of vulnerable young people or vulnerable women. There's some sadism there when you're using that big of a platform and the vulnerability people have, your kind of platform that you have, your power to perpetrate, really atrocious, very clear abuse and violation. But, I think just some different categories that are helpful, because you're right. Every community no matter if it's a family system or a church or a certain like community system, is going to be made up of human beings,
Hmm.
and hurt is going to happen and harm is going to happen. I think the question is there a misuse of power um, that is being used to exploit, either to get access to abuse or to manipulate and control, that actually is doing damage and harm to people's spiritual formation, to their capacity to trust God, to their autonomy? Because the reality is, when we see God and Jesus as this kind of full expression of God in the scriptures, Jesus is not coercive.
Hmm.
He's provocative, he's prophetic, he's not manipulative and controlling. And so, things that I like to think about is like, is there a grooming happening? Like, is people's desire for care and belonging being exploited, being manipulated and twisted? Is there gaslighting? Like when people are like, something about this feels wrong, or, we can't ask questions. Like there's no room for doubt, or like autonomy or exploration of faith, or there's no transparency with the leadership. And if we ask about something, we get scapegoated in the community and kind of exiled and cast out. That's just, it becomes much more clear. But again, you can also have spiritually abusive cultures. And I think that that's something that's really tricky about our current moment we find ourselves in,
Hmm.
because we're swimming in some cultural waters that are not new. It's like a tale as old as time. You look at the prophet Micah and the way in which he's calling out the religious leaders of the day and the ways they, are mixing power and economy, power and social norms, power and religiosity in a way that he's saying, this is not from God. So when we look at our current cultural moment, and we're dealing with things like Christian nationalism or certain supremacy structures that are wedded to theological ideals, it's almost like, oh, then we have these cultural realities that are very spiritually abusive, again, because they are fusing these ideals and promises and like really beautiful things of God and the gospel with a kind of earthly power that
Hmm.
really can only do harm. It can maybe bring some goodness to a few, but not for all. And so I think that's where sometimes it can get confusing for people, because you see a lot of people saying, making connections to maybe their experience. I myself could be one of them, like of purity culture, especially in like the 90s and the 2000s, which again, I think is more of a reenactment kind of abuse, where people had really good intentions in some regard for why they were wanting young people to kind of get this message around purity. But man alive, was it so abusive in its like tools and tactics. There was very little trauma. If you were sexually abused, good luck, because there was no one giving any kind of caveat around that. There were certainly racial purity ideals being mixed in the water that weren't necessarily maybe explicit, but they were felt. And so you can also have an experience of a culture that, I don't think, I know I could talk to my parents and they wouldn't say, oh, yeah, we just wanted to control your body. But it was like, yeah, well, all those messages were pretty scary and really kind of aligned my sense of salvation with my capacity to be pure,
Hmm.
right? Which starts to move outside of what we actually know is core to the gospel, at least with regard to salvation. So,
Well, I think that's probably a good bridge to, um, the other side of this. We've been talking about what spiritual abuse looks like and what behaviors from leaders and people who wield
yeah,
power can be abusive. But what about from the other side, from someone who has
yeah,
been in one of these relationships or in one of these churches? I think one of the hard things about identifying things like spiritual abuse is for many of us, we only have just a handful of church experiences, maybe only one.
that's
I'm
right.
actually I'm leading the church that I grew up in as a child
Grew
right
up
now. I've only
in,
ever
yeah,
attended two churches my
right.
entire life, and so, for some people, I think it's hard to even have a good gauge of what is healthy and what's not. Something that
Yeah.
isn't normal at all might feel very normal to someone if that's all you've ever experienced. So, what would be some signs, some symptoms in your in your own life that might be some flags that, maybe you have been in an abusive environment that has been causing some harm in your spiritual life? Like what would you want people to be aware of?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think there's two layers to this, right? Because there's that layer of like, yeah, I mean, again, this is true of people I work with. It doesn't matter what form of abuse. If it's your normal, it's your normal. And you could, to me, have the most explicit story of abuse, and you're still probably going to bring it in a way that's like, but I mean, what's that bad?
This kind of happens to
Because
everybody, right? I
it's
mean,
your normal, right? Yeah. And so I would say with regard to spiritual abuse, like, does God actually feel like gracious? Do
hmm,
you, when I think about when I'm talking with someone like, yeah, do they feel like they can have doubts and questions and there's like a space for that? How rigid are the boundary lines of like behavior, like control? Like, at what point can you lose the love of God or lose access to community? Is that line like really close, or is there some, space to be human, to be complex, to suffer and not always, have the right answer or have the right feeling? But ultimately, the signs and symptoms of spiritual abuse are going to look like the signs of symptoms of any form of abuse. So you are going to see the impact on mental health. You're going to see for sure with spiritual abuse, um, a lot of impact on a person's autonomy. Can they think for themselves? Are they, because a lot of spiritual abuse, you're not really allowed to think for yourself. You typically are kind of formed to like make decisions with the input of authority figures to, have huge aspects of your life, economic realities, relational realities, like who you can date, what you do with your money, sometimes even like where you should live and what kind of community you should live in, who you should be interacting with and who you shouldn't be interacting with, who's good and who's bad. So I think, ultimately there is a huge psychological, emotional, and physical impact to spiritual abuse, in part because unlike, let's say, maybe you get in a car accident and you have a kind of trauma that's like, well, yeah, that's a one time kind of closed in time and space traumatic event. It makes sense and you have recourse to deal with it. Spiritual abuse is often more falls into the category of complex trauma because it's more pervasive, it's more chronic over time, it's so communal.
hmm.
So, like you're saying, your sense of belonging and community and care and like access to so many things is bound up in the place you're experiencing harm. So, um, yeah, I mean, I could talk more about like the impact of the trauma, but I think at its core, spiritual abuse is an attachment wound. So, where there's a lot of shame, where there's a lot of fear. So, shame and fear are ultimately huge tools of spiritually abusive relationships and contexts and ideologies. So, when you think about your relationship with God, it's mostly bound by fear and shame. Now, again, part of that can come from other harm you're experiencing in your life, right? But if you feel like, no, this is the way I've been like taught to like think about God, to engage the text, and this kind of the hermeneutic I've been given to read scripture, way that you read, I would say you need to ask some good questions
Hmm.
um, around like, what have you taken in? Certainly, if you have experienced any form of abuse, emotional, physical, sexual, financial, from a spiritual leader or, a parent who is kind of like the spiritual leader of the home, it's a really good frame to have, but it might need to be something that gets addressed after other forms of abuse get addressed, if that makes sense. And I
Yeah,
think that's
definitely.
what happens for a lot of people is like, it's pretty rare that like if you've experienced spiritual abuse, you've just experienced spiritual abuse. And so I actually think it can be a little easier for people to access, while I have this clear thing that I know was wrong from like a spiritual authority, whether it was, you know, violence or emotional abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse. And then there can be space to go, so how has this how did they wield their authority to groom in a way that gave them, like, that made me more vulnerable. I also think, yeah, I mean, ultimately for me, I think that sense of personhood is really going to be a good indicator. Like, do you actually get to be a person in relationship with God, in community, um, who has some autonomy, even as you are longing to submit and surrender to a community, to the wisdom of others. But at the end of the day, there's still some intuition you get to have around what's good and trustworthy and right and wrong.
That's good. I'm curious, if you were speaking to pastors, if you were speaking to people
Mhm.
who have a role to play in developing church culture and welcoming new people, even if it's just somebody who's leading a small group or
Mhm.
teaching a Bible study, or even just, a greeter or somebody in the prayer room, someone who uh, gets to be involved in some sort of ministry as the face of a church. Like, what are some things that churches should be aware of? What's the thing that churches should be doing um, to create a space where people who have experienced spiritual abuse can feel welcomed, cared for, can feel safe as a part of your church community? Like, what are some things that churches should be doing in this space?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think pursuing any kind of trauma-informed training where you're just getting the basics of, like, how does trauma, especially trauma that's coming from abuse, impact a person's body, their nervous system, their sense of being able to trust and relate to others, and their sense of being able to trust their own mind. I mean, that can just go a long way, but I really think it comes down to power, because one of the things I talk about in an online course we've created with the Allender Center called Spiritual Abuse and Healing Online Course, to just give, again, more tools and categories, is that power in and of itself is not, like, evil. Um, Even in the gospel story, like, we are wildly empowered to, like, walk with the Spirit and move with the Spirit. If you're a parent, like, power differentials exist. I'm a parent of a 2.5-year old. If I don't use my power well, like, if I abdicate my power, she's having meltdowns out the wazoo because she's not like supposed to be, like, more powerful, than the adults in her life. That's really scary for a kid. So what does it look like to have a more honest, like, inventory of the power that you have,
Hmm.
and to steward that with a lot of humility and wisdom? Um, People who have experienced spiritual abuse are gonna have triggers. And the goal of healing is not to, like, just get rid of the triggers. It's to grow more awareness of what they're connected to, and to have tools to kind of find help when you need it. So I think pastors and leaders and communities can go a long way in being more hospitable to bodies that are, like, really traumatized. And I think if you have, how your power is shared or not shared in your community. What kind of systems of accountability do you have? Are you a community that can practice repair? Ultimately, at the end of the day, for, like, any survivor of abuse, there's usually been a profound lack of accountability and zero possibility of any kind of repair. Usually, forgiveness is weaponized to protect the most powerful. Like, we just need to forgive this person because, you know what? The ministry is at stake. If we expose
Hmm.
this, all of God's work is going down the drain. And I think I just want to say to pastors and leaders, like, if that's where you go, you don't actually trust the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah,
And if
absolutely.
we are people who can practice owning where we've harmed or maybe misused power in a moment or from the pulpit, again, you're going to have to use power, but are you abusing it or misusing it? If you can have moments where you can say, you know what, I need to take some accountability for this. And I understand, like, I was afraid, or this is coming out of my own trauma, and I'm committed to doing some transformative work. But if you can center the most vulnerable in your community and create safeguards for them, where, again, there's more transparency, there's a plan in place if someone is abused in your context that's not going to be protecting the abuser. And again, it doesn't have to be then moving towards, there can be an imagination for a restorative justice. It just can't be a process that requires the person who's been victimized to move too quickly to any kind of thing without there being any consequence or a genuine capacity to repair. Most people have experienced a huge rupture in relationship when they experience someone having the maturity and the ego strength to like move toward repair. That in and of itself can be incredibly healing. But yeah, I think again, where you can have more honesty about your power structures, processes in place that bring some balance and accountability to that power, and restorative imagination where maybe people misstep and need support to get help, maybe to step out of leadership for a season, and how to again, it's kind of revolutionary because our culture has lost some of these skills, right? So that feels, I'm aware I'm saying things that actually feel incredibly risky to any person in leadership, right? Because like any one person could accuse you of something and then it feels like what do we do here? And so I think, there are some great organizations that support churches in investigations and offering tools to kind of help safeguard. And I think there's a lot more people thinking about this and writing about this and offering more resourcing. So I think just being able to take it, because it's not abusive to have kind of a mission and a place that you're moving together, and communal rules of engagement that are set in place to really try to honor people and create a greater sense of safety, even though, I mean, all of us know we can't ever create a perfectly safe place,
Yeah.
even in our own personhood, as much as we'd
Yeah.
like to.
I mean, I think one of the things that stood out to me in what you were saying is just this recognition of the power that you have. I think so often one of the ways things get sideways is just because people aren't aware of the power
Hmm.
that has been given to them, the way that people see them. I mean, one of the things I've talked to often with our elders is training them that when you are talking to anyone from our church, you are always talking as an elder. You can't ever
That's
not
right.
be one. Even you
That's
don't
right.
see yourself that way. You don't walk
That's
around
right.
viewing yourself as an elder, but you are, and people see you that way. And so every comment you make, every question you ask, I mean, and that it's a burden, honestly, to carry that. It
Hmm.
it changes the way
That's
that
right.
relationship dynamics work, but you have to be aware of that, or else often you end up saying things that carry just so much more weight than you even
That's
realize
right.
you're carrying. I think one of the other things that can happen in churches with just a lack of recognition of power and authority in particular is systems can become abusive, not because any individual is trying to be abusive, but because no one is owning the authority to care for the
Hmm.
system.
That's
So,
right.
I can think of examples just in our own ministry where, maybe um, expectations have been unclear for people in our staff of what they're supposed to do, and they're feeling even gaslighted because,
Hmm.
their supervisor has a set of expectations that they think they're meeting, but their supervisor has a different set of expectations, and they don't know who's they're supposed to meet. They're caught in the middle and those
Right.
sorts of things. And in that situation, often what's going on is all the people involved think that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and it's someone else's fault that the problem is
Hmm.
what it is. And no one is owning the responsibility for the whole thing. No one is
Hmm.
recognizing, and in my case, I'm a lead pastor, and so ultimately, all the systems in our church, I have
Hmm.
to be willing to say it is actually I have been given the power. It is my authority that needs to be used to make sure that these systems aren't becoming abusive and aren't getting off the rails. And if I shirk that responsibility, if I decide like,
Right.
it's not my thing, it's somebody else's fault, it's
I'd
whatever.
rather blame someone else because I don't want to be responsible for it. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And so I think just a self-reflective assessment of what power you really have is so important. And that's far beyond just um, ministry leaders and pastors. I mean, that's, if
Right.
you're a small group leader of 8 people in a church, there's power
Right.
that
Hmm.
goes along with that. And, you need to understand that if you're going to wield that power well. So yeah, I think that's really, really helpful. What would you say to someone who feels like they're in a situation that might be spiritually abusive. I mean, maybe they just
Mm,
say, church is really hard right now.
hmm.
I'm not sure I trust my pastor. I'm burned out. Whatever it is, like, but they just don't know what to do with that. They don't know, yeah, what steps to take. Like, what would you encourage someone to do who feels like they're in an unhealthy situation, but just kind of is frozen right now?
Yeah. That's such a delicate question. And ultimately, I would probably need more data and more particularity about their situation. Because for so many people, what would keep them in a really unhealthy or even potentially dangerous or abusive context is the loss just feels too great, right?
Mm,
Like, I might lose like a really core sense of community. I might lose access to God if that's where if that's what I've been told and that's how I've been shaped. Even if logically, I mean, this is the way trauma works, right? Like, even if logically you could say, I know that's not true, it doesn't matter if it feels true in
yeah,
your nervous system, right? Um, or maybe they feel like, how could I trust myself? And a lot of times that feels even scarier, um, to kind of actually own, I don't know how to make a decision because I don't even know if I trust myself. Again, that might be a really good indication that you've experienced some kind of abuse. It doesn't always have to be spiritual. Um, but that deep sense of like, I can't trust myself. Um, so what I tell people I work with is like, well, one, find a trustworthy kind of person outside of that context,
yeah,
who's not as biased, whether it's a therapist or maybe a spiritual director, or a trustworthy friend who you feel like is wise and has a lot of humility and isn't necessarily going to project their own hurt or abuse onto you, and start sharing some of the stories. I also think it's always okay to take like a sabbatical.
mm,
And sometimes what we need is just a little space. We need a little space to like even determine what is it that we feel. And is the dynamic I'm dealing with just like, yeah, I'm tired. It's been a really it's been a hard season with all that we faced in the world, if you're serving people or doing certain things. But if a context has become more of a place of desolation than like consolation, than a place where you do feel encouraged and, um, some sense of being held in mutuality with others, like moving toward, God in a way that brings life or trying to live into the kingdom of God in whatever ways we're called to in the gifts that we have. I think about if a relationship or a context feels more death dealing than life giving, it's a really good idea to take a pause, take a step back, create some safety of distance, and trust your body. Again, sometimes what's happening is trauma from other experiences is getting really activated and it's coloring everything. Sometimes our body is telling us, you are not safe
mm,
and you've been gaslit. And so you can't tell what's up from what's down and you need some respite. But I do think finding safe enough care can be really helpful to discern in those moments. Someone who can make space to like ask the right questions, to give you space to check in and ponder. It's not always feasible, to just leave a community or leave a relationship. And that might not always be what needs to happen, but sometimes it
yeah,
is.
yeah,
And there might need to be an actual process in place for that to become a reality. Um,
yeah,
and I think there just has to be a lot of grace towards that. Now, if someone is in clear harm's way, then I think that's a different category of like, yeah, you need to ask for help from trustworthy people who will actually get you to safety.
yeah. I think that's helpful. I think, yeah, finding somebody outside of your system is so important. Somebody who has a little bit of objectivity, and I think so often that kind of advice can be just really eye-opening,
Hmm.
because we don't know how normal our own situation is. Everything feels
Yeah.
normal to you when you're in it. I think the other thing I might suggest to someone is if you have suspicions, if you have struggles, especially in a power dynamic with authority, with with a pastor, with a leader, with something like that, if you can find another leader, another pastor outside of a system that
Mhm.
understands those sorts of things that you trust, that would be so helpful. I think, um, I mean, this is a little self-serving of me since I am a lead pastor, but I think just culturally right now, we're all pretty suspicious of authority and power.
Mhm.
And I think if you want to find people who will agree with you that a leader,
Mhm.
that an authority figure is abusive, has done things wrong, like you will be able to find them, whether that person really
Mhm.
is truly abusive or whether they're really doing the best they can in a tough situation or anything like that. And so finding someone who has the ability to say, and I've been in a situation like that. I've led in a church. I've led in this context. I'm not going to defend everything a leader has done, but maybe here's some things to think through about what this person's juggling, what their perspective might be. Another way to look at this. Like if there's someone in your life that you trust that has that background, I think they can be really helpful as well. I Yeah, I've loved having this conversation, Rachel. Thank you for your insight on this, and I appreciate the help because I really want to lead a church that is helping people heal. And yeah, so I appreciate the time today. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really good to be with you. And I just want to say I'm always deeply encouraged by churches that are trying to do the hard work to make space to even explore mental health as a part of our spiritual formation.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just like last thing I'll say, because I know you're trying to wrap up and I keep talking, but like so much of my story and my trauma like came with, I think, good intentioned people who just brought so much harm to my spirituality because they didn't understand how it was being impacted by trauma. And I just think, man, if I was in a church context where even one person from a pulpit was talking about mental health as something good and like not outside of God's care, or not just something, if I don't have good mental health, that like I'm in sin, would have
yeah.
revolutionized my life.
Wow.
And so I just want to say thank you for taking the initiative to have these conversations with people and to give people imagination that God cares deeply about our whole personhood. And
Yeah.
God made our brains. So,
Amen.
and God made our nervous systems.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great talking to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Once again, that was Rachael Clinton Chen, and I hope that conversation was helpful to you as you process through spiritual abuse and how the church can be a part of the healing of anyone who has experienced that. If you want to learn more, we'll send a link to Rachel's course online at the Allender Center for Spiritual Abuse, and also to her bio where you can find out more about what she's doing and how to follow her work. Thank you for being a part of what we're doing here at Native Exiles, and I hope you'll share this podcast with anyone that you think might benefit from it. We'll see you again soon on Native Exiles.